History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 6 The Great Acceleration. Chapter 5 The European World Hegemony. The world economy came to a sharp focus in London, where the financial services which sustained the flow of world trade were centered. A huge amount of the world's business was transacted by means of the sterling bill of exchange. It rested in turn upon the international gold standard, which sustained confidence by ensuring that the main currencies remained in fairly steady relationships with one another. All major countries had gold currencies, and travel anywhere in the world was possible with a bag of gold sovereigns, $5 pieces, gold francs, or any other major medium of exchange, without any doubts about their acceptability. London was also, in another sense, the center of the world economy because although the United Kingdom's gross output was by 1914 overtaken in important respect by that of the United States and Germany. She was the greatest trading nations. The bulk of the world's shipping and carrying trade was in British hands. She was the main importing and exporting nation and the only one which sent more of its manufacturers to non European nations than to European. Great Britain was also the biggest exporter of capital and drew a huge income from her overseas investments, notably those in the United States and South America. Her special role imposed a roughly triangular system of international exchange. The British bought goods manufactured and otherwise from Europe and paid for them with their own manufactures, cash, and overseas produce. To the rest of the world, they exported manufactures, capital, and services, taking in return food and raw materials and cash. This complex system illustrates how little the European relationship with the rest of the world was a simple one of exchanging manufactures for raw materials. And there was, of course, always the unique instance of the United States, little involved in export, but gradually commanding a greater and greater share of its own domestic market for manufactured goods and still a capital importer. Most British economists believed in 1914 that the prosperity with which this system enjoyed and the increasing wealth which it made possible showed the truth of free trade doctrine. Their own country's prosperity had grown most rapidly in the heyday of such ideas. Adam Smith had predicted that the prosperity would continue if a closed imperial system reserving trade to the mother country were abandoned, and so, in the case of America, it had soon proved, for a big expansion had come to Anglo American trade within a few years of peace of 1783. By 1800, a majority of British exports were already going outside Europe, and there then still lay ahead the greatest period of expansion of trade in India and East Asia. British imperial policy was directed less to the potentially embarrassing acquisition of new colonies than to the opening of areas closed to trade, for that was where prosperity was deemed to lie. One flagrant example was the Opium War of 1839 to 1842. The outcome was the opening of five Chinese ports to European trade and the de facto cession to Great Britain of Hong Kong as a base for the exercise of jurisdiction inseparable from the management of commerce. In the middle of the 19th century, there had been for a couple of decades a high tide of free trade ideas when more governments seemed willing to act upon them than ever before or after. In this phase, tariff barriers were demolished and the comparative advantage of the British, first among the trading and manufacturing nation, had continued. But this era passed in the 1870s and 1880s. The onset of a worldwide recession of economic activity and falling prices meant that by 1900, Great Britain was again the only major nation without tariffs for protection, And even in that country, questioning of the old free trade dogmas was beginning to be heard as competition from Germany grew fiercer and more alarming. Nevertheless, the economic world of 1914 still seems, in retrospect, to be one of astonishing economic freedom and confidence. A long European peace provided the soil in which trading connections could mature. Stable currencies assured great flexibility to a world price system. Exchange control existed nowhere in the world, and Russia and China were, by then, as completely integrated into this market as other countries. Freight and insurance rates had grown cheaper and cheaper. Food prices had shown a long term decline, and wages had shown a long term rise. Interest rates and taxation were low. It seemed as if a capitalist paradise might be achievable. As this system had grown to incorporate Asia and Africa, it too came to be instrumental in a diffusion of ideas and techniques originally European, but soon acclimatized in other lands. Joint stock companies, banks, commodity and stock exchanges spread around the world by intrusion and imitation. They began to displace traditional structures of commerce. The building of docks and railways, the infrastructure of world trade, together with the beginnings of industrial employment, began in some places to return peasants into an industrial proletariat. Sometimes the effects on local economies could be bad. The cultivation of indigo in India, for example, more or less collapsed when synthetic dyes became available in Germany and Great Britain. The economic history of Southeast Asia and its strategic importance were transformed by the British introduction of the rubber tree. There, a step which also incidentally was to ruin the Brazilian rubber industry. Isolation, first disturbed by explorers, missionaries, and soldiers, was destroyed by the arrival of the telegraph and the railway. In the 20th century, the motor car would take this further. Deeper relationships were being transformed too. The canal opened at Suez in 1869 not only shaped British commerce and strategy, but gave the Mediterranean new importance. Not this time as a center of a special civilization, but as a route. Economic integration and institutional change were inseparable from cultural contamination. The formal instruments of missionary religion, educational institutions, and government policy are only a tiny part of this story. European languages, which were used officially, for example, took with them European concepts and opened to the educated elites in non European countries the heritage not only of Christian civilization but of secular and enlightened European culture too. Missionaries spread more than dogma or medical and educational services. They also provoked the criticism of the colonial regime itself because of the gap between its performance and the pretensions of the culture it imposed. In the perspectives of the 20th century, much of what is most durable and important in the impact of Europe on the world can be traced to such unintended, ambiguous effects as these. Above all, there was the simple urge to imitate her weather, expressed ludicrously in the adoption of European dress, or much more importantly, in the conclusion drawn by many who sought to resist European hegemony that to do so it was necessary to adopt European ways. Almost everywhere, radicals and reformers advocated Europeanization. The ideas of 1776, 1789, and 1848 are still at work in Asia and Africa, and the world still debates its future in European terms. This extraordinary outcome is too often overlooked. In its unraveling, 1900 is only a vantage point, not the end of the story. The Japanese are a gifted people who have inherited exquisite artistic traditions, yet they have adopted not only Western industrialism, which is understandable enough, but Western art forms and Western dress in preference to their own. The Japanese now find whiskey and claret fashionable, and the Chinese officially revere Marx, a German philosopher who articulated a system of thought rooted in 19th century German idealism and English social and economic facts, rarely spoken of Asia except with contempt, and never went east of Prussia in his life. This suggests another curious fact. The balance sheet of cultural influence is overwhelmingly one sided. The world gave back to Europe occasional fashions, but no idea or institution of comparable effect to those Europe gave to the world. The teaching of Marx was long a force throughout the 20th century Asia. The last non European whose words had any comparable authority in Europe was Jesus Christ. One physical transmission of culture was achieved by the movement of Europeans to other continents. Outside the United States, the two largest groups of European communities overseas were, as they still are, in South America and the former British colonies of white settlement, which, though formally subject to London's direct rule for much of the 19th century, were in fact long, oddly hybrid, not quite independent nations, but not really colonies either. Both groups were fed during the 19th century, like the United States, by the great diaspora of Europeans whose numbers justify one name which has been given to this area of European demography: the Great Resettlement. Before 1800, there was little European immigration except from the British Isles. After that date, something like 60 million Europeans went overseas, and this tide began to flow strongly in the 1830s. In the 19th century, most of it went to North America and then to Latin America, especially Argentina and Brazil, to Australia and South Africa. At the same time, a concealed European immigration was also occurring across land within the Russian Empire, which occupied one sixth of the world's land surface and which had vast spaces to draw migrants in Siberia. The peak of European immigration overseas actually came on the eve of the First World War in 1913, when over 1.5 million left Europe. Over a third of these were Italians, nearly 400,000 were British, and 200,000 Spanish. 50 years earlier, Italians figured only to a minor degree. Germans and Scandinavians loomed much larger. All the time, the British Isles contributed a steady flow. Between 1880 and 1910, 8.5 million Britons went overseas. The Italian figure for this period was just over 6 million. The greatest number of British immigrants went to the United States, about 65% of them between 1815 and 1900. But large numbers went also to the self governing colonies. This ratio changed after 1900, and by 1940, a majority of British immigrants was going to the latter. Italians and Spaniards also went to South America in large numbers, and Italians to the United States. That country remained the greatest of the receivers for all other nationalities. Between 1820 and 1950, the United States benefited by the arrival of over 33 million Europeans. Explanations of this striking demographic evolution are not far to seek. Politics sometimes contributed to the flow, as it did after 1848. Rising populations in Europe always pressed upon economic possibilities, as the discovery of the phenomenon of unemployment shows. In the last decade of the 19th century, too, when immigration was rising fastest, European farmers were pressed by overseas competition. Above all, it mattered that for the first time in human history, there were obvious opportunities in other lands where labor was needed, at a moment when there were suddenly easier and cheaper means of getting there. The steamship and railroad greatly changed demographic history, and they both began to produce their greatest effect after 1880. They permitted much greater local mobility so that temporary migrations of labor and movements within the continents became much easier. Great Britain exported Irish peasants, Welsh miners and steel workers, and English farmers. She took in, at the end of the 19th century, an influx of Jewish communities from Eastern Europe, which was long to remain a distinguishable element in British society. To the seasonal migration of labor, which had always characterized such border districts as southern France, were now added longer term movements as Poles came to France to work in coal mines, and Italian waiters and ice cream men became part of British folklore. When political changes made the North African shore accessible, it too was changed by short range migration from Europe. Italian, Spaniards, and Frenchmen were drawn there to settle or trade in the coastal cities, and thus created a new society with interests distinct both from those of the societies from which the migrants had come and from those of native societies besides which they had settled. Easier travel did not only ease European migration. Chinese and Japanese settlement on the Pacific coasts of North America was already important by 1900. Chinese migrants also moved down into Southeast Asia, Japanese to Latin America. The spectacle frightened Australians who sought to preserve a white Australia by limiting immigration by racial criteria. The British Empire provided a huge framework within which Indian communities spread around the world. But these movements, though important, were subordinate to the major phenomenon of the 19th century, the last great Volkerwanderung of the European peoples, and one as decisive for the future as the barbarian invasions had been. In Latin America, the term was invented in the middle of the 19th century, which attracted in the main Italians and Spaniards. Southern Europeans could find much that was familiar. There was the framework to cultural and social life provided by Catholicism. There were Latin languages and social customs. The political and legal framework also reflected the imperial past, some of whose institutions had persisted through an era of political upheaval at the beginning of the 19th century, which virtually ended Spanish and Portuguese colonial rule on the mainland. This happened because events in Europe had led to a crisis in which weaknesses in the old empires proved fatal. This was not for want of effort, at least on the part of the Spanish. In contrast to the British in the north, the metropolitan government had attempted sweeping reforms in the 18th century. When the Bourbons replaced the last Habsburg on the Spanish throne in 1701, a new era of Spanish imperial development had begun, though it took some decades to become apparent. When changes came, they led first to reorganization and then to enlightened reform. The two viceroyalties of 1700 became four, two more appearing in New Granada, Panama, and the area covered by Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela, and La Plata, which ran from the mouth of the river across the continent to the border of Peru. This structural rationalization was followed by relaxations of the closed commercial system, at first unwillingly conceded and then consciously promoted as a means to prosperity. These stimulated the economy both of the colonies of those parts of Spain notably the Mediterranean littoral, which benefited from the ending of the monopoly of colonial trade hitherto confined to the port of Seville. Nonetheless, these healthy tendencies were offset by grave weaknesses which they did not touch. A series of insurrections revealed deep seated weaknesses in the Spanish Empire. In Paraguay, 1721 to 1735, Colombia, 1781, and above all, Peru, 1780. There were real threats to colonial government which could only be contained by great military efforts. Among others, these required levies of colonial militia, a double edged expedient, for it provided the Creoles with military training which they might turn against Spain. The deepest division in Spanish colonial society was between the Indians and the colonists of Spain descent, but that between the Creoles and the Peninsulares was to have more immediate political importance. It had widened with the passage of time. Resentful of their exclusion from high office, the Creoles noted the success of the British colonists of North America in shaking off imperial rule. The French Revolution also, at first, suggested possibilities rather than dangers. As these events unrolled, the Spanish government was embarrassed in other ways. In 1790, a quarrel with Great Britain led to, at last, surrender of the remnants of the old Spanish claim to sovereignty throughout the Americas, when it conceded that the right to prohibit trade or settlement in North America only extended within an area of 30 miles around a Spanish settlement. Then came wars, first with France, then with Great Britain twice, and finally with France again, during the Napoleonic invasion. These wars not only cost Spain Santo Domingo, Trinidad, and Louisiana, but also its dynasty, which was forced by Napoleon to abdicate in 1808. The end of Spanish sea power had already come at Trafalgar. In this state of disorder and weakness, when finally Spain itself was engulfed by French invasion, the Creoles decided to break loose, and in 1810, the Wars of Independence began with risings in New Granada, La Plata, and New Spain. The Creoles were not at first successful, and in Mexico they found that they had a racial war on their hands when the Indians took the opportunity to turn on all whites. But the Spanish government was not able to win them over nor to muster sufficient strength to crush further waves of rebellion. British sea power guaranteed that no conservative European power could step in to help the Spanish and thus practically sustained the Monroe Doctrine. So, there emerged from the fragments of the former Spanish Empire a collection of republics, most of them ruled by soldiers. In Portuguese Brazil, the story had gone differently, for though a French invasion of Portugal had in 1807 provoked a new departure, it was different from that of the Spanish Empire. The Prince Regent of Portugal had himself removed from Lisbon to Rio de Janeiro, which thus became the effective capital of the Portuguese Empire. Though he went back to Portugal as king in 1820, he then left behind his son, who took the lead in resisting an attempt by the Portuguese government to reassert its control of Brazil, and with relatively little trouble, became the emperor of an independent Brazil in 1822. A glance at the map of contemporary South America reveals the most obvious of many great differences between the revolutions in North and South America. No United States of South America emerged from the Wars of Independence, although the great hero and leader of independence, Simon Bolivar, hoped for much from a Congress of the new states at Panama in 1826. Nothing came of it. It is not difficult to understand why. for all the variety of the 13 British colonies and difficulties facing them. They had, after their victory, relatively easy intercommunication by sea and few insurmountable obstacles of terrain. They had also some experience of cooperation and a measure of direction of their own affairs even while under imperial rule. With these advantages, their division still remained important enough to impose a constitution which gave very limited powers to the national government. It is hardly surprising that the southern republics could not achieve continental unity for all the advantages of the common background of Spanish rule which most of them shared. The absence of unifying factors may not have been disadvantageous, for the Latin Americans of the early 19th century faced no danger or opportunity which made unity desirable. Against the outside world, other than the United States, they were protected by Great Britain. At home, the problems of post colonial evolution were far greater than had been anticipated and were unlikely to be tackled more successfully by the creation of an artificial unity. Indeed, as in Africa, a century and a half later, one legacy of colonial rule was that geography and community did not always suit political units which corresponded to the old administrative divisions. The huge, thinly populated states which emerged from the wars of independence were constantly in danger of disintegrating into smaller units as the urban minorities who had guided the independence movement found it impossible to control their followers. Some did break up. There were racial problems too. The social inequalities they gave rise to were not removed by independence. Not every country experienced them in the same way. In Argentina, for example, the relatively small Indian population underwent near extermination at the hands of the army. That country was celebrated by the end of the 19th century for the extent to which it resembled Europe in the domination of European strains in its population. At the other extreme, Brazil had a population of majority of which was black, and at the time of independence, much of it still in slavery. Miscegenation was traditional there, and the result is an ethnic mix which may well be the least troublesome to be found in the world today. Finally, an important part of South America's colonial inheritance was a set of economic relationships with the outside world, which would be slow to change. They would lead later to denunciation of the continent's economic dependency. But the legacy had another side to it. Much of the continent's wealth would never have been there but for colonialism. Every plantation crop grown in Brazil had been brought there by Europeans from overseas: sugar, coffee, chocolate, cattle, wheat. The new Latin American states could not draw upon any tradition of self government in facing their many problems, for the colonial administrations had been absolutist and had not thrown up representative institutions. For the political principles they sought to apply, the leaders of the republics looked in the main to the French Revolution. But these were advanced ideas for states whose tiny elites did not even share among themselves agreement about acceptance and practice. They could hardly produce a framework of mutual tolerance. Worst still, revolutionary principles quickly brought the church into politics, a development which was perhaps in the long run inevitable, given its huge power as a landowner and popular influence, but unfortunate in adding anti clericalism to the woes of the continent. In these circumstances, it was hardly surprising that during most of the century, each republic found that its affairs tended to drift into the hands of caudillo, military adventurers, and their cliques who controlled armed forces sufficient to give them sway until more powerful rivals came along. The cross currents of civil war and wars between the new states some very bloody, led by 1900 to a map which is still much the same today. Mexico, the most northern of the former Spanish colonies, had lost vast area in the north to the United States. Four mainland Central American republics had appeared and two island states, the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Cuba was on the point of achieving independence. To the south were the 10 states of South America. All of these countries were republican. Brazil had given up its monarchy in 1889. Though all had been through grave civic disorders, they represented very different degrees of stability and constitutional propriety. In Mexico, an Indian had indeed become president to great effect in the 1850s, but everywhere there remained the social divisions between Indians, mestizos, those of mixed blood, and of European blood, much reinforced in numbers when immigration became more rapid after 1870. The Latin American countries had contained about 19 million people in the 1800. A century later, they had 63 million.